Another day, another story. Columbus Day is a U.S. holiday that commemorates the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas on October 12, 1492. It is observed on the second Monday of October, falling this year on October 14, 2024. Columbus Day became a federal holiday in the United States in 1937, originally intended to honor Columbus's voyages, which were historically seen as opening the Americas to European exploration and colonization. Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. However, the holiday has become increasingly controversial due to the negative impact of European colonization on indigenous peoples, including the exploitation, diseases, and violence that followed. Many critics argue that celebrating Columbus perpetuates the glorification of colonization and ignores the suffering of Native Americans. As a result, several states and cities across the U.S. have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. This alternative holiday celebrates and honors the history, cultures, and contributions of Native American peoples, offering a more inclusive narrative of history. Early celebrations and rise as a federal holiday. The origins of Columbus Day date back to the late 18th century, when various groups, especially Italian-American communities, began celebrating Christopher Columbus as a national hero. Columbus, an Italian-born explorer, became a symbol of pride for Italian immigrants in the U.S. at a time when they faced discrimination. In 1892, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival was marked by many celebrations across the U.S., and this laid the groundwork for the holiday. In 1934, under pressure from the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic fraternal organization, President Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaimed October 12th as Columbus Day, and 3 years later, it became a federal holiday. This was seen as a gesture to honor Columbus, as well as to recognize the contributions of Italian Americans to the nation. For many, Columbus Day was a symbol of American progress, exploration, and the blending of cultures, changing perspectives, indigenous resistance. As the civil rights movement gained momentum in the mid-20th century, Columbus Day came under increasing scrutiny. Native American groups, historians, and activists began to highlight the darker side of Columbus's voyages, emphasizing the beginning of European colonization, which brought with it genocide, forced labor, disease, and land theft that devastated indigenous populations across the Americas. Indigenous Peoples Day and national debates. The alternative celebration, Indigenous Peoples Day, first emerged in 1977 at a United Nations-sponsored conference on discrimination against indigenous populations in the Americas. The idea began to gain traction in U.S. cities and states in the late 20th century. In 1992, in recognition of the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival, Berkeley, California, became the first city to officially replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. Since then, many other cities, states, and institutions have followed suit, including major cities like Los Angeles, Minneapolis, and Seattle. Indigenous Peoples Day focuses on the survival, resilience, and contributions of Native Americans. It serves as a counter-narrative to the glorification of colonialism and celebrates the enduring cultures of indigenous peoples in the face of historical oppression. Modern observances today, Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day, are observed differently depending on location. Some areas, especially those with strong Italian-American communities, continue to celebrate Columbus with parades, festivals, and events that honor Italian heritage. Meanwhile, other regions host educational events, cultural performances, and discussions about Indigenous rights and history to mark Indigenous Peoples Day. The growing shift toward recognizing Indigenous history reflects a broader movement in the U.S. to reconsider national narratives, challenge historical myths, and create a more inclusive understanding of the country's past. Columbus's historical legacy. When Christopher Columbus embarked on his journey in 1492, his aim was to find a westward sea route to Asia. Instead, he stumbled upon the islands of the Caribbean, mistaking them for part of Asia. Though his voyages marked the beginning of European colonization in the New World, Columbus himself never set foot on the North American mainland. Italian-American identity and Columbus Day. While Columbus's legacy is debated today, for much of the 20th century, Columbus Day held particular significance for Italian Americans. Italian immigrants faced significant discrimination when they first arrived in the U.S., particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Anti-Italian sentiment was fueled by stereotypes about Italian crime, poverty, and Catholicism. In this context, Columbus became a symbol of pride and a way to assert Italian Americans' place in U.S. society. In fact, one of the key moments in Columbus Day's rise came after the 1891 lynching of 11 Italian immigrants in New Orleans, one of the largest mass lynchings in U.S. history. The event led to a national backlash and strained diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Italy. In 1892, to help ease tensions and acknowledge the contributions of Italians, President Benjamin Harrison issued a proclamation encouraging Americans to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, laying the foundation for the later establishment of Columbus Day. For decades, Columbus Day parades, particularly in cities with large Italian-American populations like New York and Chicago, became important expressions of ethnic pride. The rise of Indigenous Peoples Day. The growing recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day signals a significant cultural shift. In 2021, President Joe Biden became the first U.S. president to officially recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, marking a historic step in the federal acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples' contributions and struggles. While Columbus Day remains a federal holiday, Biden's proclamation reflects changing attitudes and the increasing recognition that Indigenous voices and histories have long been marginalized in American discourse. The push for Indigenous Peoples Day has gained momentum as part of broader movements for racial justice and historical reckoning. The holiday aims to honor the resilience and contributions of Native Americans while drawing attention to the ongoing challenges they face, including systemic racism, poverty, and the protection of land and cultural heritage. Columbus statues and controversies. In recent years, the controversies surrounding Columbus have extended to statues and monuments dedicated to him. Many of these statues have been the target of protests and have been removed or vandalized. The summer of 2020, during the wave of protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd, saw many Columbus statues taken down or officially removed by cities across the U.S. The removal of these monuments has been part of a larger conversation about public symbols of historical figures tied to colonialism, slavery, and oppression. Supporters of statue removal argue that these monuments glorify a violent past and should be replaced with symbols that reflect values of inclusivity and justice. On the other hand, some Italian-American groups have opposed the removal of Columbus statues, seeing it as an erasure of their heritage. Ultimately, the growing movement around Indigenous Peoples Day is part of a global trend to revisit colonial history and center the voices of those who have been historically oppressed. The shift from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day symbolizes a deeper reckoning with America's complex and often painful past, seeking to build a future that is more just and inclusive. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.